a transcription is something that you're writing through something, and as you're writing through, you're thinking along the way as you go. Whereas an arrangement, to me, would presuppose that you haven't done very much to the shape to alter it, and also, of course, they reflect the context, the actual topic, the piece, because a country tune is less posh than a melody would be, and a Gershwin arrangement is the term that most arrangers use when they're doing stuff for singers who are going to sing a Gershwin song on a show or cabaret. And transcription is a more highfalutin term that you might use about operatic work, and it's traditionally transcription and paraphrase is the usage of Liszt and Busoni and various other composers who made operatic transcriptions for piano. And so I was already dealing with these issues and wrestling with these issues, and my teacher, Bernard Stevens, who's an extraordinarily sensitive and erudite man, suggested that I read the essay by Busoni about transcription. And he suggested this because Busoni's view of transcription is a very global one, very holistic one. Busoni basically says all musical activities are in some form transcription. Well, there were two decisions I made. The first one was that I wasn't going to transcribe things literally, so the aim wasn't to produce a piano arrangement, the Gershwin word, but a straightforward transcription. In as much as such a thing is possible, you do sometimes find those easy arrangements of the Czardas from Die Fledermaus or something. So I wasn't going to do that, and I wasn't going to do just a kind of decoration of the original. I set my mind to actually composing with the material, pretty much as if it was my own, because by the time I made the choice of what to do, it becomes like the subject of a... Well, here we go with analogies, so already treading on very thin ice here. It's when you decide to do a portrait. Let's say I decide to make a portrait of you as a photographer or as a painter. Then, of course, you are the subject. And I'm not simply reproducing you. If I take a photograph of you, I choose lighting, I choose an angle to photograph you from, because my view of you, of course, is not your view. Famous quote from Picasso about Gertrude Stein. He painted Gertrude Stein. She said, "It doesn't look anything like me." And he said, "It will." And you can read any number of quotations from Hockney about this sort of aspect of portraiture and how the amount of work that you have to do as a portraitist, I mean the hours of sitting, the hours of looking at somebody's face, is very different from the way photography works. Not that it's any less or any more, but it's just different. So I was thinking about this. What am I doing if I'm transcribing? And in our discussion earlier, before the camera was switched on, before the microphone was switched on, I said that actually I think all music is there. So in a sense, all musical ideas are ready game for transcription. In a sense, is it even possible to take anything, any collection of sounds, and for it not to be a transcription? Because all those pitches are just there, all those dynamics are just there, and you can pretend that you're abstracting them out of thin air, but of course you're not, and as soon as you start joining pitches together they resemble something else. And so I decided I'm not going to play this game of originality either. It's not the issue. And of course I'd read books about the process is what you're doing, not the material. So I just focused on that and got on with it. And in fact, I don't think I I've ever really had a problem, because to me, with a much more, if you like, mature visual arts training, the visual arts had already dealt with that with figures like Marcel Duchamp. And so if collage and montage in cinema and objet trouvé were part of the visual arts vocabulary, it didn't seem at all controversial to use them in music. It seemed entirely natural. And I frequently, if I'm asked to do this, I frequently refer to my models from that world, Rauschenberg and David Hockney and Warhol and Stan Brakhage, are as important, in some ways maybe even more important, than the whole chain of musical influences one goes through, you know, Satie, Debussy, Bartók, Xenakis, Schoenberg. And also, can you not filter? Of course you can't not filter, because this is working all the time, and you're not only consciously making choices, but you're unconsciously making choices. So it depends on whether you had a happy childhood or not, what your knowledge is, what your experiences are. All of these are filters. Of course, who you are, where you are, what you do, who you're friends with, who you fuck and who you eat dinner with, makes an incredible amount of difference to what kind of work you do, what kind of music you write. Would we really think it couldn't be like that? So it's all filtering. I wanted to think about whether I was a photographer or not, because I was brought up with photography. My father was a photographer. And he was a qualified surveyor, but his job, when I remember what he was doing, when I was maybe 3 or 4 years old, I used to go around with him, and what he was doing at that stage was documenting the rebuilding of London photographically. So he was preparing an archive of the rebuilding of London after the war. And it was quite interesting work, although I don't suppose I recognised that then, I do now. And I wondered, I started writing the piece 2004-05 maybe. So it's not an early piece. And I was wondering, well, have I been a photographer all these years? You know, am I just continuing his work? Because I do sometimes casually refer to what I do as a kind of documentation. And I do put myself into my work to an extent that some composers don't, and I acknowledge my sources to an extent that most composers don't. I actually do that in the score. I list the pieces, and as we go along, there's a little arrow saying, this is a quote from blah. I'm not a photographer. I read a lot about photography. We were talking earlier about Roland Barthes and Camera Lucida, and there's Susan Sontag's book on photography, and there are quite a few other tomes about the meaning of photographs, the background or the reading of a photo, which I find very fascinating, if slightly offensive, because photos are a visual medium, and visualizing something is not a narrative. It's not a literary process. The way in which a photograph evolves, and sometimes the information it's designed to impart, are not at all the same as writing a story or describing a thing. You're sometimes revealing a thing in the same way Paul Klee writes about revealing an object by painting it or by drawing it. So you're actually extracting something, which is not, I'm not literary either, so it's not something I find in literature. And one has to be careful in music, because what are you doing? Are you simply supplementing? You're adding sounds to the world that haven't been there before. Question of taking responsibility for doing that, needless to say. So what are you seeking to do? Are we bringing sounds out of nothing? Are we simply making a kind of refuse dump of of sound, or creating some pompous edifice of, people refer to works as monumental. I really hate that word. I mean, it's like these dreadful buildings in Paris, and everything is like pseudo-Romanesque memorial to something. And I don't design monuments, I have adventures. I go on journeys if I need to talk about pieces. The process is one of discovery. So I set myself a task thinking, well, I might have a good time if I do this. So if I find I'm not by day 3, then I scrap it all and start something else, because I'd be a fool not to, right? So what is it? It's both uncovering and disclosing and investigating. It's performing an autopsy, it's instinctive, it's very technical, it sometimes gets very abstract. The thing about the Hockney print up there is the extent to which you're not seeing what is depicted, because if you say, okay, this is tree, it's a road with trees alongside of it, end of story, that is just about nothing one of the content of that painting. So it's actually about painting. So if I tell you that something is called Alcan Paganini, it's about 0.0001% about Alcan and Paganini. Even though the amount to which I'm quoting Alcan and Paganini in the same way as Hockney is quoting a tree, that's certainly there. But any sense that it was actually by Paganini or by Alcan, long gone. Because that's not the point. That's not what I'm doing. I'm not transcribing in order to reveal what's there already. Which is the odd thing about, why would you write down a tune that's in your head? This is the commonplace question, isn't it? Oh, do you write music down? Is it in your head first? Do you write it down? I thought, well, no, if it was in my head first, there wouldn't be any point in writing it down. It would be so boring. Come on, Susie.
Oh, what a good girl.
It's true, aren't you? Sometimes.
Great.
Oh, bit wet. You down the basket and dry off.
Okay, we're good.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh yeah, no, that was lovely, and I have it all recorded. Walter Benjamin, Susan Sontag, and Roland Barthes. Today I'm particularly interested in the engagement with Barthes, and I'm curious, how has he influenced your thinking, and if so, how?
Not as much as Walter Benjamin.
Oh, okay.
I mean, the reason I didn't mention Benjamin when I said, the piece was dealing with references to Barthes and Sontag, was that Benjamin is so much more than a philosopher of photography. I mean, Benjamin's projects and the whole way in which he looks at the world are fundamental to the way I think about producing.
Can you tell me more about that?
Not in any detail, I can't really, but I mean, I read an awful lot of Walter Benjamin's writing, certainly not all of it, but a great deal of it. And the interface between reality and meditation, between recollecting in tranquility, as Coleridge and company in the 19th century put it, and what it is that the artwork is actually when you've made it. Well, I mean, it's all there in Benjamin, and if I could quote Reams, I would, but I can't. I just said, well, go away and read it, because it's essential. And it's the modern world. It's not. It's like reading Wittgenstein. It's not the 19th century anymore.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas to an extent, in a funny kind of way, I think Barthes is more than 19th century.
Yeah, sure.
It's very It's very nostalgic.
Yeah.
It's very much about memory, which is an important facet of what I do too, how we remember stuff and so on. But the narratives that hang off memory are different for Bart than I think they would be for me. I'm not investing that kind of. It's a very sentimental attitude to it. And not in a bad way, but it uses sentiment as the key element. But I wouldn't do that because that doesn't bring in as much technique, and I'm interested in the technique too. So I'm interested in what my pen can do, what my eye can do, what my ear can do, what I can hear, what I can analyse, and so on. None of that has anything to do with sentiment. That's all very objective. At least it seems so to me.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So it's interesting. I haven't declared much interest in Benjamin because it's almost too important. It is a transcendence of time and place when you're composing.
What do you mean by that?
It means that you're not aware of where you are, who you are, what you're doing. But the best composing happens when you lose awareness of that. I mean, of course you're in a kind of control, but Feldman, isn't it, that says, or was it Rauschenberg? I just can't remember. It was Feldman quotes Rauschenberg quite a lot. And I think it's Rauschenberg that says, let the brush do the work. So there's something about holding the brush, and what you see is what you're doing, but you're actually escaping from that at the same time. So you're not manipulating it. You're allowing the itness to manipulate what happens next. It's a transcendence of self. Out of body experience. And probably I could have either been a photographer and been quite happy doing that. I could have been an anthropologist and been quite happy doing that too. So maybe one day I shall write a piece called The History of Anthropology in Sound. But I'm doing that all the time. I enjoy changing stuff. Why do I enjoy doing that? Because it makes it feel more alive. And I just set some words which have always been very, very important to me. They're from a short novella, I think you call it, it's unfinished, by Buchner, Georg Buchner, who wrote the play that Berg based Wozzeck on. And in it, Buchner pretends to be Lenz, who's another quite agitational and modernist, I don't know how to describe it, alternative kind of German writer from the early 19th century. And he makes Lenz say, all I demand of art is that it has life. Isn't that fantastic? And that's all I demand too. And when I find that my pieces, to me, don't have life, I either burn them or I change them until they do. And what is life? Unpredictability, spontaneity, love, hate, everything. Nothing excluded. Because otherwise you haven't told the truth.
Haven't told the truth? What do you mean by that?
Well,
I mean, haven't told the truth of what it means to be alive?
Yes, you haven't told the truth of what it is to be alive now. You haven't said to the audience, this is what life is, this is what life can be. You know, not sitting in rows in some fucking concert hall listening to some guy play the piano for 5.5 hours. That's not life. It's part of life, but not the whole of life. So don't get confused about what it is. This piece is about life in all its diversity It's a sort of exemplar which you take away with you and you think about afterwards, and you say, oh, I see, okay, right, yeah, my life's a bit like that too. And I'd be really happy with that kind of response. It doesn't need anything more intelligent. Well, actually, I think that response is very intelligent.
When we were walking here, you told me that I asked you how you were doing, and you said that you really liked what you were working on, and that it was sort of new in the way that you related to found material. And I said, stop, we'll talk about that on camera. So what did you mean by that?
I've found some different things to do, different ways in which I can make it clear to the audience what the relationship is between the found object, which is alluded to or quoted with alterations, and how one moves away from that to something else and comes back to it. So it's really the degree of focus, or where things are. Can I describe this cinematically without confusing the issue? Probably not. But it's like if you work in close-up or you work in medium shot or long shot. And it's quite interesting. There's a wonderful film by Carl Theodor Dreyer called The Passion of Joan of Arc. And it's nearly all in close-up, which you hardly notice it until you think about it, and then you think, oh my God, it's all in close-up. Which is really weird, because we're used to seeing things change in perspective. So it's that kind of thing. It's a very small thing. It's like Hitchcock's Rope, which is all done in very, very long takes. But do you notice? Unless you're looking for it, no, you don't. And that's not the point, except that he's having a hell of a time showing you can do it.
Yeah.
You know, and working out how you can do it. Because, of course, if you want any kind of camera movement, you've got to arrange the choreography in a particular way, and it creates a nightmare of stuff, technically. And so relating to Schubert in the way that I'm doing it in this piece has created a nightmare of things I've got to be really ingenious about doing. And I'm having fun doing that, of course, because is it Stravinsky that says the more limitations you set yourself, the better it is? You know, in a way, these things are limitations, and you've got to get past them to do a good job. Because I don't want anybody to see what I'm doing and say, "Oh my God, he's done that! Oh, how fantastic!" Because that would be to destroy the whole point. So I don't want it to be clever. It's just I'm having fun. It amuses me anyway. I don't know.
So, how would you say that your sort of relationship to transcription, how to transcribe or why to transcribe, or any of these sort of issues around identity or portraiture that we've been talking about, has this changed throughout your life? Was it much different when you were younger? Is it different now than 10 years ago? This sort of thing.
When I was younger, I think I believed that the culture would change.
Oh.
So I believed that people would listen less to classical music, and it. I mean, I didn't know anything about the industry, so I was probably very naive to do that. But the story was not. What happened was I was very scared when I went to the Royal College, because I'd never had any proper composition training before, and by midday, most days, I had a headache. And I couldn't see the wood for the trees, so I had to get out of there. And the Victorian Albert Museum is very close to the Royal College of Music, so I used to seek sanctuary in the V&A. And it's a museum, and it rejoices in the fact that it's a museum. You know, it doesn't try and hide the fact. Well, it doesn't more now, but it didn't then. It was archetypal Victorian museum. You know, it was dusty. It was full of weird objects and objects, exhibitions and stuff. And I thought, oh, this is kind of cool. You know, it's sort of why would anybody get this sort of place together? And then I heard people describing the culture that we lived in, this is mid-1960s, as a museum culture. And I thought, well, so what's the problem with that. You know, I like museums. I like being in the Victoria and Albert Museum. So I thought, well, I'm going to turn this around. I'm going to make a museum. I mean, some aspect of my work is going to be the creation of a Victoria and Albert Museum, all of my own.
Do you mean this in a way related to all of your relationship to all of these references that you use?
Yeah, because I've been fairly systematic in working through the history of Western European music and also the way in which exotic musics from the Orient and the Near East and remoter corners of places like Transylvania and Azerbaijan have impacted on, generally speaking, Central European, not to say Austro-German tradition. So in my work you can find pieces which reference Hildegard of Bingen, actually fairly extensively. I keep returning to that because it's so fine, and the fact that it's monodic and so effective, and that it has spiritual radiance thrills me. So it goes all the way from Hildegard up to parodies of the present day. And so all of these things are in my museum, in little cases with the labels on, and sometimes they're little jokes that can only be appreciated if you know these composers really well.
I like how you talk about when you say the Western tradition or Central European tradition, and then how these sort of exotic musics have informed it, and you say that that's your topic. This brings up sort of the question of are you the outsider to these musics, or are they
always outside?
You're always outside.
Yeah.
Even with Brahms.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can go to Hamburg, but Brahms isn't there, and Brahms's way of writing music is wonderful, but it's not possible anymore. It's not tenable anymore as a choice, and one can stand back from it and see it. I mean, I don't want to get too much into this because I don't really think that's the reason I do it. Mostly it's curiosity. I'm curious about these things, and I like them and possibly feel guilty about them, like Saint-Saëns music, for example, which I adore, but I feel guilty about liking it so much. And it seems strange to me that French composers have always done more about exotic music than most other nations have. Africa and Spain and so on, a lot of French composers have written music about those countries. And it interests me too that when English folk music was finally being properly collected and documented, it was by clergymen and the moneyed classes, and they're usually collected at competitions at which folk singers used to sing their best numbers. Now, no folk singer will ever give you his best number, actually, but they've got some pretty sensational material nonetheless. But were they the best people to be collecting it? I don't think they really were, because their class was completely different. And of course they were patronising these poor people, these people who were their servants, and often vastly senior in age. So when Granger, and Granger was the best of them probably, was collecting folk music with wax cylinder recordings, he was collecting folk singers that were probably 50 years his senior, and they could have been his servant. Now, I wonder what sort of social attitude that was, never experienced it, and what effect it had on something like the desperation to do the job in a particular kind of way. But of course it's all that we have, so, and that's the purpose of having a museum, isn't it? It's putting those objects there so that we can interrogate them. So it's a very confrontational museum, mine.
And there's this nice quote from Sontag about this relationship, perhaps. To photograph is to appropriate the thing photographed. It means putting oneself into a certain relation to the world that feels like knowledge, and therefore like power.
Exactly. That's it in a nutshell. So it gives me a spurious kind of power, and it gives me a spurious kind of satisfaction, which I try and move on from constantly, which is why I'm setting myself challenges all the time, because I'm never satisfied with what I do, but I want it to be as good as it can be, and I want people to know these things intimately and to interrogate them. And it's not going to happen in my lifetime, probably, sadly, because youngsters who are now coming to my music are very respectful, which of course I like that, but it'll be interesting to see what they really can find there, and that's the only real thing I hope to leave behind me, is something that's worth looking at and investigating, as I have looked at those topics and interrogated them. I think that is our responsibility, to interrogate and puzzle over the world that we have, because we can.
When Bart talks about photographs, one of the things that he is, as I said, that pricks him is this this time business, that there was something that was present that can no longer be touched, and he finds this painful.
Yeah, it's very poignant, isn't it?
And it seems to me that there are composers who that this is their relationship to music of history, that they're mourning that it's gone. But I don't sense that in what you're saying, and I don't sense that in your music. What is your relationship with this sort of time distance?
I don't think I'm melancholic. I'm not melancholic about time. I am melancholic. I think anybody that's aware of mortality is going to be melancholic, because you're painfully aware, and the nearer I get to that moment, you're aware that you're not here forever, and these things are not going to last maybe more than a few years. So it's impossible not to be slightly melancholic about it, but I'm not morbid about it. I think we should celebrate that, and we should look it in the face and stare it down and say, this is the way it is, it's the way it's always been. And basically I want to go in mid-sentence. I don't want to do the one thing I grew to dislike very much about Brahms are the long farewell codas. You know, it's like that kind of melancholy I don't like very much. Although I'm quite happy to parody it every now and again, but I like to cut off at the end and say, whoop, oh, where did that go? This is what I do. This is who I am. And as Hockney said once in an interview about painting, and he said, well, this is what I was put here to do. It's no big deal, I just get on with it, you know. He paints every day, he's 80 plus. And he goes out there with his easel, you know, it's just every day, it's like cleaning teeth.
Yeah.
And I think that's how it should be, it's not a big deal, you know. I don't have to go into some super meditative state to compose. Look, I mean, look at the mess, you know, this is, well, I've tidied it up a bit, but before I went to meet you at the station, it was just covered in paper. This is just a chaos. I know where it all is, you know, but it's the breakfast got mixed up with it, and you know, here's the dog treats now on the table, and pots of tea. it's just that ordinary, you know. It's no big deal.